Go on to say something a little more constructive about one of the main notions, at least in the title, that of collective memory. So in the Academy, the notion of collective memory it's one of these kind of buzz notions that's really taken off in the last 10 years, particularly, most prominently, in Holocaust studies. This is a picture of a famous sort of wall of photographs at the Holocaust Museum in Washington. I was at about a year and a half ago. And more generally, in history and sociology, in the study of nationalism, there's a lot of focus on this idea of the memories of collectives, of groups that have identities that are ongoing and are regulated by the particular forms of memory that they engage in, particular kinds of commemorative activities that they use to regulate themselves. There have been other, in some sense, less politically loaded contexts in which this talk of collective memory has taken off. Phil Pettit, for example, talks about legal and corporate contexts in which you have high-level institutional decision-making that he wants to claim we need to invoke the notion of a sort of a group mind or a collective mind that's got a memory component to it, but the emphasis there is on decision-making is another kind of putative group mental ability, and also in discussions of collective intelligence, there's a longer sort of tradition that goes back to the very foundations of social science and the work of Durkheim, and also picked up in some of the earliest work that we might retrospectively identify as the work in philosophy of biology on social insect colonies coming out of Harvard in the early part of the 20th century. I'm interested in not just collective memory as a construct and how we think about it. I mean, I am interested in that, but not only that. I'm interested in the particular sorts of practices of collective memory or collective remembering. Okay? And here it's the idea, it's not the individual who's doing the acts of memory, or if it's individuals, they're in a particular sort of social context, and that context is not just some incidental feature of the forms of remembering that they engage in. It's really, those forms are, if you like, intrinsically constituted by the particular social context in which they take place, even if it's the activities of individuals, or whether it is the activities of groups themselves that we think about as being the subjects of memory here. And I think there's a lot to be said, and in part I've learned what I do know about this from the work of Sue Campbell at Dalhousie, though I don't think she puts things in quite as psychoanalytic way as I have it kind of framed here, thinking about remembering with a certain kind of social recognition and a certain kind of social stamp of authority on it as a form of working through for a community to sort of revisit traumatic events in the past in some way that has a constructive kind of outcome because of that very activity of remembering. Okay? So it's modelled on the case of the individual and the idea of working through some traumatic event through psychotherapeutic interventions. But the idea is we can apply that kind of model over to thinking about what might happen in a social context of remembering. That would be that's a way to characterise a practice of collective memory. And of course, if you think about it with that analogy in mind, many of these forms of remembering at the group level are going to be difficult. They're going to be very emotional. They're going to be very charged. They're going to involve, in some cases, rightful embitterment. People are going to be, sort of pissed off because of the way in which they were treated, and working through, going through that process of working through communally in a semi or fully public way is going to involve basically a lot of tears, a lot of hurt, a lot of painful reliving. But at the same time, at least as I see it, and I think as it's developed in a lot of different communities in which this has been practiced, and you can probably pick your own favourite sorts of examples here, it also leads to a kind of self-affirmation. In some cases, it may be the only way to exercise that kind of self-affirmation and to recover oneself and to move forward. So you might think in Canada, the sort of process that is on people's minds more recently since the summer apology, the Residential Schools Commission, Sue Campbell herself has worked directly as a philosopher, advising and writing for the Residential Schools Commission in the Native community. Another sort of example that is brought to mind by the recent visit of Sarah Schulman to campus, and I will just get this up, is the work of ACT UP New York. So Sarah Schulman was an activist in the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power in New York in the early 1980s for about 7 or 8 years. And over the last 6 or 7 years, she has created this oral history project. This is the website for it, for ACT UP, where she's interviewed the 100 remaining living members of ACT UP New York. The interviews range, I think, from about 30 minutes to about 4 hours, and they're all fully available. They're video interviews on this website as transcript. You can download them free, or you can get 5-minute snippets of each of them, or you can request the whole lot. And it's a very powerful way to remember not only a social movement, but the phenomenon that it was a social movement about. Okay, so it's a kind of archiving sort of project that I think fits into this, can be fitted into this model of collective memory. But the case that's most on my mind is the history of eugenics in Western Canada and its connection to contemporary disability and its study, because the moment I'm engaged in a project that's just, in some ways, of this type, it's not perhaps well formed enough to say it's taken exactly this direction or that direction, but for the last few years, and that's part of what forming the What Sorts of People network is about, is trying to get academics, activists, community members, sterilization survivors, members of disability organizations together around a set of sort of common questions and issues and concerns that will involve some kind of practice of collective memory, and they have been involving those practices.